Introduce Susan Hill, who's going to lead us into a conversation about lead reduction.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here again with all of you. Today, we're taking a deep dive into scopes, so we can really explore the potential with leveraging the lead hazard reduction program with CDBG, ARS, IPR. Today, the two scopes I've pulled up for you, however, are our standalone projects. They were referrals from the health department, children with elevated blood lead levels. So our providers just needed to address those homes, address those lead hazards. So that's what the scopes are for, lead only. But I realized in previous presentations, I really haven't done this kind of deep dive into a lead scope in particular. So as we're walking through it, you're going to see other building components that will, of course, be a part of your other rehab projects. So you can really start to imagine what LHR can really cover when we grade a job. So thank you, Sherry. I always start off with this reminder and this cute little boy, why we're here. Let's put our lead hats on and remember the young children in our life. This is about making housing safe for our youngest and most vulnerable population, leveraging those all important dollars on your projects, and delivering at the end an even safer, more holistic housing rehab project for your community. Okay, thank you. All right. This one is for you, Earl and Tamika. This was the first job in our program that Southside Outreach Group took on. And thanks to them, we all learned a lot along the way. And I'm going to showcase it today because just of the great legacy of this organization and my public now gratitude for what they took on in taking on our first job. This was an EBL referral from the local health department. It was two young children with elevated blood lead levels. And we'll sort of walk through what we discovered in the property. And Earl or Tamika, if you're on, please feel free to chime in if I get any of the details incorrect, since you lived it firsthand. Sherry, you can skip next. So this is so every project that we undertake receives a full lead inspection and risk assessment. The lead inspection identifies the presence and the condition of lead-based paint, whether it's intact or deteriorated, and its location. And the risk assessment is going to measure any hazards like lead dust, lead in soil, lead in water. So this is a snapshot from the lead risk assessment and the high levels of lead dust that were identified in the living room. You'll see I've flagged the living room floor and the living room windowsill as coming above the action level. But one more unique discovery was actually the bathtub coming back having a very high level of lead. It was a lead coating that had been deteriorating. And ultimately, the risk assessor felt like that was the source of the child's lead exposure. But this is a lot of this work, especially with the case of an EBL, you are acting as an investigator to really identify the source of the exposure. So Sherry, you can flip to the next slide. So this is a snapshot from the report and just gives us the idea of the scope. And another reason I picked this project was to showcase kind of the gamut of scopes we can have. And while this was a smaller scope project, what it lacked in sort of the size of the scope, it certainly made up for in a lot of the beautiful client management that SOG needed to undertake with this particular household as well. So while I'm saying it's a small scope, the project was actually quite large in other aspects. But because we found high levels of dust in the living room and really inside the house, the only things we identified as having lead-based paint were the French doors and lead dust, in the vicinity of that. Also, you'll see in here there was a fireplace mantle that might have gotten refinished at some point and left residual lead dust in the household. But then you'll see below the bathtub really being pointed to as the main and sort of likely exposure for the children's elevated blood lead levels. So I want to highlight, and we mentioned this in the workshop yesterday, sometimes these scopes and scales aren't that bad. It's sort of like going to the doctor, and sometimes you just kind of get an easy report, and the scope and scale doesn't have to be this enormous, overwhelming undertaking all of the time. So this felt, I think, pretty satisfactory to be able to identify readily enough where those childhood exposure was coming from. Thank you, Sherry. And I'll just flag some of the great pictures. I'm sorry, that one got flipped somehow. That SOG shared with me of the HEPA vac and containment being put up, and outside, that important identifying that lead work is going on, and so no occupants can enter the space at that time. And they shared some great photos of during the abatement with me. So that is case study number 1. And again, I envision Southside Outreach Group responded to this project again as just strictly addressing this childhood lead poisoning case. But if this house had been part of a greater rehab, LHR would have come in and paid for those components that I just went over. So that can certainly help when you're looking to, of course, stay within cost limits. And I've said this many times, I'll say it again, we don't walk away from any lead hazards. So while we do have cost limits, of course, in our other programs, LHR will sort of pick up anything exceeding that if it's an identified lead hazard. So keep that in mind. Thank you, Sherry. Next slide. Okay, so this was another very large property and project, another EBL child, unfortunately, a very large family that needed to be relocated while the work was done. And Sherry, you can start flipping to the next slide. Now, I've pulled this from the lead inspection risk assessment. And so you'll start seeing, the risk assessor will very clearly lay out where those lead hazards are identified. So here she's listed all the deteriorated lead-based paint found in the inspection, going room by room, side by side, component by component, where that lead is, because that is so critical, of course, to developing the scope of work. You need to know exactly where it is. So I'm sorry, it's an art, I think, pulling information off PDFs and trying to make it engaging. And I hope I've done somewhat right by you all, but I apologize for the lists of items. But this one is a long one. Sherry, you could go ahead and flip to the next slide because it goes on and on and on. So this is very detailed work. It definitely takes that eye for very, much so attention to detail to make sure you're encompassing everything that the risk assessment is revealing in developing the scope of work. So I'm going to go through, just let you all sort of skim the extent of this 4-bedroom house and where all the lead hazards were identified. And Sherry, you could skip to the next slide. So this is the dust level. So this is a very important complement, of course, to where is the lead-based paint, what condition is it in, and is there lead dust, which is really the main culprit behind exposure, especially in children, is the ingestion and inhalation of that dust. So you'll see our action levels. A floor is 10 micrograms per square foot and a windowsill is 100. So you'll see in bold which rooms presented hazards. And some of them, like that windowsill in bathroom 1 coming in at 544, that's quite high. You'll see that there is evidence of a lot of lead dust throughout the house that is above the action levels. And the action levels were actually lowered within the last few years. Floors used to be 40 and now they're 10. Okay, thank you, Sherry. Here's some photos from the property, just so you can see the evidence of the deteriorated paint throughout the house. I imagine this looks very classic to what you are seeing in your regular rehab projects. So LHR really can cover the cost of abating these hazards, either through removing the building components or stripping the paint. LHR can cover that. So looking at homes through that lens is really going to stretch all of those dollars and then ultimately make them even lead safer. More lead safe. Did I just create a new verb? Thank you, Sherry. Okay, so this is an example of the scope from the house we just saw. I want to highlight some of these items for the difference between interim controls and abatement. Baseboards that aren't impact surfaces or, of course, friction surfaces. The lead hazard control, or the LHR, the lead hazard reduction program, can go ahead and conduct interim controls on items like this. So just making sure the paint, stripping the paint, getting it down to an intact level, and priming and painting over top is fine for something like a baseboard. A friction surface like a door jamb that you'll see listed in the second one, we want to remove, of course, that paint altogether to eliminate the potential of any lead dust. And another thing to note in the scope is identifying the scale of each component by the amount of linear feet and having that line item for your contractor to bid on. Thank you, Sherry. I want to highlight this building sketch. So you'll see side A, B, C, D. It's very important in the world of lead, knowing exactly where you are in the room, and each corresponding room would have its own A, B, C side, A, B, C, and D sides. You'll notice that all the windows are labeled. The windows in the front have been flagged to be rehabbed to meet protocol with the Department of Historic Resources, while the others are flagged to be replaced for the most part. It is our preference to replace windows because they are, again, such a cause for lead dust and that very problematic friction surface. So whenever possible, it's easier, and that's HUD's guidance as well, to just go ahead and replace that window. Thank you, Sherry. So that, what I just illustrated, I'm going to show how that plays out in the scope. So you'll see in this scope, they've explicitly stated which windows, it's the lower level 1 through 3, and then the upper level windows 11 through 14 are going to be rehabbed, and with explicit instructions on the protocols for that. And then Sherry, you can flip to the next slide. And then for replacement, again, identifying each window by number, exactly which windows we're replacing, and more protocol around that as well for the abatement contractor to bid on. Thank you. So that is the extent of our lead scopes. And I wanted to bring in some examples of healthy homes assessments too. You've heard that brought up a couple of different times. And we do have an opportunity, if you have utilized the lead funding into a project, there's an additional $5,000 in healthy home supplemental funding that will likely be available to you. We have enough, HUD extends this opportunity to cover a good amount of the units in the program. It might not be available on every unit, but it is another opportunity to make the numbers work for you. So you'll see the list of 29 hazards that HUD identifies. And then this is one methodology. We can provide you with this documentation of sort of going through room by room, identifying a hazard, and then the corresponding hazard that would encompass. So you'll see in this particular chart, the first one in the bathroom was flagged under the personal hygiene, sanitation, and drainage category. Others have been flagged under being a potential for pests. And all of this seems to be related to moisture, which, as we know, is one of the #1 issues in a house. So all of these pieces, and Sherry, you can flag to the next page, would then be in a summary of the healthy homes opportunities prioritized, as far as the money can stretch. And we're able to extend this, as I said, to many homes. So this home that just got this extensive lead work, and the project total was around $40,000 in abatement and interim controls for the property, also received roughly around $5,000 in healthy home supplemental funding. So that's not unusual to have an investment of that size from the program. Okay, we can flip to the next slide. And this is a slide that I've shared with you all before, but I hope as I've been talking, you've been considering jobs of the past, jobs of the future. And if any of these components or scopes or approaches are you're able to envision wrapping that into jobs in the pipeline, please, LHR can cover so much of that work. I've shown this slide before with CDBG and IPR. And in this presentation, I didn't get into the sort of nitty gritty of braiding. I've talked about that before, but if you haven't heard me and my pitch, please reach out because I can go into sort of more of the administrative programmatic side of braiding jobs. But yes, there's more effort. Lead is it can be complicated. Like I said, it's very much detailed work, but it's worth it. And we have structured our programs to compensate you for that. Hopefully, we know you all always go above and beyond, and it's hard to equate time and dollars and passion in all those ways, but we hope we've established these programs to at least be able to compensate you for the effort you're putting into making this layering happen. And then, of course, for my ARS folks, that this program is much easier to implement when you don't have that client to relocate. So I always encourage my ARS providers to please consider partnering with us. I do want to just give a special shout out to the providers already working with us who have jobs in the pipeline. A lot of them are standalone projects. I get referrals, individual homeowners or renters who reach out. I get referrals, like I've said, from the health department. No one has said no to me yet. They might, I don't know if they've regretted it or not, but everyone has been a willing partner so far, and thank you. So right now we have Bay Aging, Hampton RHA, SIRCAP TAP, Southside Outreach Group, Southside PDC, all actively working on projects in various stages right now. Some are at still intake and some were farther along in the process. So I really want to thank you all for the effort you've put into this program already. And it's a big lift from all of us to continue to make this successful in the coming years. Sherry, thank you.
Hey, Susan, could I ask a question real quick?
Of course.
So I'm still not completely sure about entrance into the lead hazard reduction. When you listed the ARS house as a possibility, nobody's in that house yet. We're looking to sell it.
Right.
We don't know if there's going to be a child in there. We don't know if there will be anybody over the age of 60, but
Right.
We're able to still do it as the lead hazard reduction, even though we know there's no EBL child or, types of things.
Yes. Thank you for flagging that, Kenny. You can, because the key is needing to market that home once it's completed to a family and using the language that it is lead safe, ideal for families, showing that you are making that marketing attempt to a family. And I know so many of the homes do go to families. We have a small margin of error within the program that if it is an ARS home and it is an owner occupied home and it somehow doesn't go to a family, that can be okay. We have a little bit of room there. We can do maybe a handful of properties that might turn out that way, that we're saving for ARS if that indeed happens.
And so that being said, then when somebody's setting up a community development block grant, could they say they're assumed that 2 of the houses maybe will be lead hazard reduction, or should they not include that?
Could you elaborate on that, Kenny, a little bit
more?
So
when you're going through your planning grant, you're trying to determine the cost for your houses in the community development block grant, you might determine that we're going to use lead hazard reduction funds on 1 or 2 of our houses because of the age. Is it okay to do that using that?
Oh, yeah. Front? Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I saw Sanji, the large home. Yeah, I think that was about $40,000 in lead work. So we've talked about cost limits, and there you have it. I mean, that's where lead can come in. We don't walk away from hazards, like I said. So we've talked about 12,000 coming from LHR, 12 from CDBG in a lot of our pairings, but that'll be 12 from CDBG, and it can be another 30 from lead or whatever it needs to be. So that's really one of the great things about this program. I feel really fortunate to be able to say you don't have to stress so much about what everything is costing with this program, because really the paramount thing is making lead safe housing for children, and everything else just kind of falls into place behind it, whatever it costs. Thank you, Janet. Thank you for that comment. And thank you, Ellen, too.
And remember, as Susan's talking about this with ARS, for those ARS grantees, ARS is required to be paid back. The construction money is in it when you sell the home, but the lead is not. So please remember that as you're pairing these two together, that's money that's a grant that is not calculated into your sales price and what equity you would walk away with from the property.
So are you saying that's free money, Sherry? Not too loudly, though.
Being a government worker, I never say free, but
understand.
Free.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, thank you all so much for engaging today and continuing to look at your properties and considering this program. And thank you to all who are currently working on active jobs. I very much appreciate you.
All right. Thank you, Susan. That was absolutely wonderful. It is 2:11 and we are going, Cassandra actually has a question for you. So will a deed of trust be placed on the home since so much money is used?
Not under LHR, not regarding LHR and using this project in a standalone way. No, it's a grant. No deed is required.
And so that begs another question for me. If we're not doing the LHR money as part of the deed of trust, those costs should not be reflected in the deed of trust, correct?
But unfortunately, even when the people using it were informed of how it was hurting people, they still didn't choose to fix it.
Is that a question we need to explore with the deed and the overall total that you were bringing up, Kenny?
I was just wondering how to accurately reflect the deed of trust that we put on the property, how much money we should show.
So
I would certainly say that it would not be included in the CDBG deed of trust.
right.
Only those funds that came from CDBG or IPR would be reflected in that deed of trust. And
Okay.
those two programs have a forgivable loan format. And so still the family is not repaying anything, but the period of affordability for both of those are 5 years. So the lien would be for 5 years. And should they sell or leave the property or something of that sort, we would recapture funding prorated.
Okay, thanks.
And Susan, we can go over this, but in our deeds, we have a clause that says total federal funding, so that there's an amount, because if that period of affordability kicks it to 10 years or 15 years, then we would reflect that. But your piece may be 5, mine might be 10, something, to that effect.
These are great questions. Thank you. And Arlene, I see your question. Arlene asked about the appraised value and the rehab costs. That's a great question. We're very fortunate right now to have ARPA funds, coronavirus relief funds, directed toward lead remediation. Under our HUD grant, unfortunately, that is an issue. I believe we can't exceed 50% of the appraised value. But with ARPA, that wouldn't apply in the same way. So we're able to serve some houses that way, like a very large project that Southside Outreach Group is currently working on. That will exceed the appraised value, but we're fortunate to have those relief funds that aren't subject to the same terms. So in the short term, Arlene, the answer is we can do it. And we might have to re-explore that again in a few years.
Hey, this is Cherry. I just wanted to mention something about a training that I took. It was the guy that trained, he was a lead assessor, and he went to a home and he was trying to find the lead, and he went through the whole house. He'd done several inspections, had the XRF machine, and the last inspection he went to, he was like, I don't know how to find this lead because the child had really, high blood level. Well, he seen the mom pour Kool-Aid for the kids out of a porcelain container, and it hit him, and he did the XRF machine on that, and come to find out it was the porcelain that was causing it. So I just wanted to throw that out there just to let everybody know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cherry. I know when you are investigating an EBL case, you have to absolutely look beyond the paint. And those risk assessors, they'll test toys, they'll test dishes, and we're fortunate that the XRF can read all of those items. It doesn't just have to be paint. So yeah, thank you for flagging that.
All right. Are there any further questions? Okay, it is 2:16.